It's no fun when our kids are sick, but we may just have found the silver lining. Apple and raspberry and orange-flavoured electrolyte slushies made by Rehydrate.
Rehydrate slushies are a tasty way to get essential electrolytes into our little ones when they're dehydrated from sickness or even just the Aussie heat. They're delicious and they'll help your little ones feel better in no time. Grab Rehydrate from Coles today.
This is the Happy Families podcast with Dr Justin Coulson. We're Luke and Susie, a husband and wife radio team with 3 young boys. This is the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants some answers now.
A topic of conversation that we're about to have is going to be one that is ultimately the theme is actually about how, as parents, we can have some of these intense and grown-up conversations with our young children because we have to, because they're being exposed to stuff from their schoolmates and in the schoolyard on computers and on billboards and in all sorts of language and conversations, and we want to avoid the conversation about things of a human nature that even the uncomfortableness of me talking about it now is what we have to face with a child who can't possibly comprehend what we struggle to articulate.
Yeah. Dr Justin Coulson is joining us in studio, and Justin, you have heard the intro that Luke gave. That got
was
a little
long-winded
awkward.
and you looked so bored.
Okay.
And Luke wouldn't say the word because I understand why he wouldn't say pornography.
Yeah.
But that's what the conversation's about. Okay, so if you've got children with you who are young, you might want to...
Go to the podcast instead.
There we go.
Yeah. So
Listen at a later time.
Yeah.
The matter that we'll be discussing is sensitive. It is. We won't be using any explicit terms or anything like that, but we are talking about explicit material and how to talk to kids about that.
Well, and that's the thing. So we've in conversations that we've had, and there's been a lot of them that I've been involved with recent times, knowing how big an issue this is in our world, and in particular with our children. The highlight was an 8-year-old who at school was looking at material and having conversations with someone's children who are also 8 and 7 in ways that go, if I'm not talking to them, their friends are, and their friends have no idea what they're talking about, and what they're saying is not what I want my children to believe or understand. So we have to have the conversation, Justin. But our 7-year-olds aren't capable of understanding. As adults, we're barely capable of understanding some of this stuff.
Yeah, so let's talk about this really, really clearly because the information that we share today will be important for every parent. The first thing that we need to understand is when children are on average exposed to explicit material, which almost always happens online. It's very rare that it doesn't. The days of finding something in quote unquote dad's cupboard or under the bed or whatever, those days are mostly gone. It's all found online now. The average age of exposure, according to the best research we've got, which isn't actually great research, is somewhere around about the age of 11.
Yeah, and that's average.
That's the average.
That's not the earliest.
No. So, I mean, there's kids who are being exposed as toddlers and infants, really. But I hear consistent stories, like the one you've just shared. Mum says, my 8-year-old was on the school bus and one of the kids in year 6 showed him something and thought it was so funny and, or all the kids are laughing and someone tries to get into the circle and then they see some explicit content. It's not unusual for children in grade 3, maybe even grade 2, so we're talking about 7 and 8-year-olds, to be exposed to explicit material. Now, at the risk of, I'm not a consumer, but I've sat in on enough talks and I've read enough research papers and I've actually lectured on the topic myself, having looked at the academic research. The material that our children are being exposed to today is not anything like the material that we may have been exposed to as teenagers back in the 70s or the 80s or even perhaps the 90s. The internet has changed it and it has become vastly more extreme and vastly more concerning. So as parents, we have got to be talking to our kids. And I know we've got to wrap this up quickly, but I've got to mention this really, really clearly. We have got to be having the conversations with our kids from, I think, somewhere around the age of 8 or 9, because the chances are they're going to come across it in one form or another. On average, by the time they're 10 or 11, we've got to be talking to them early, and that means we've got to know how.
So we're going to deal with that very soon, but this is the thing to really understand. No longer are they looking for it. being the only way they get exposed to it.
Yeah.
It is coming up when they're looking at cricket scores. It's coming up when they're searching YouTube. It's coming up when they're doing innocent things. And that is a problem because you can't filter a website with cricket scores knowing because it's not flagged as adult content. But this is some of the marketing algorithms are forcing this into your world, whether you like it or not.
Look, it is everywhere. There was a UK report from the UK Child Commissioner a couple of years ago called basically Porn is Everywhere. That was the name of the report. You can look it up online. It's a fantastic report. It's worth looking at. It's a couple of years old now, but absolutely brilliant. I would suggest that most of the time there will be some sort of warning signs, some sort of signal that you're about to tread somewhere digitally that's unsafe. And even kids that aren't that savvy will usually have a sense. Yeah. But yes, you're right. Sometimes it does just explode into their world completely unexpectedly. Usually, though, they'll be exposed to it by a web search or by somebody showing them something that they were curious about, usually an older kid, sleepover party, weekends, after school, no adult supervision. It's those kinds of environments where that stuff usually pops up.
We live in a culture that has an opt-out system, which means that everybody automatically is opted in.
Interestingly, in the UK, when it comes to explicit material, they've got an opt-in.
Yes.
And about 70% of people choose not to opt in.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if our government would actually grow a spine and do that?
Yeah.
Yes.
And look, it's a conversation on the table, but we can't make that choice on our own. But what we can make the choice of, what we do have control in, is how we help shape our young minds, the minds that are ours to raise, our children's minds around this topic of explicit material that they have access to and will be exposed to one way or another. But how do we have the conversation? Because you've said let's start talking at 8 or 9 years old
about that specific content. So let me backtrack a little bit. A lot of people will say we need to just have good filters. We need to monitor what our kids are doing online. Not good enough. You can fence your pool, but you can't fence the ocean.
Yeah.
Your children will be exposed to screens in places other than your home and on your devices.
Okay.
But once it's time to have the conversation, this should be part of a much bigger conversation that begins when our children are young. When our children are infants and toddlers, we should be talking about intimacy and privacy, talking about things like the swimwear rule and making sure that our bodies are safe. Body safety begins from a young age. As our children get older, we need to start to talk to them about issues around procreation. And I would suggest that we want to start having those conversations. And note, I'm saying conversations plural. We no longer use metaphors and say we need to talk about the birds and the bees. Good. Done. We've had that. We've had that chat. It needs to be part of an ongoing conversation about what a relationship is and what intimacy is, and specifically how to, be involved in a procreative process. Yeah. And then once we've had those conversations, we move into different kinds of conversations based on a relationship of trust. We start to talk to our kids in a prepared way. You don't just get in the car and say, "Oh, we're going to talk about pornography today with the kids. We're going to have that conversation about that explicit material today with the kids," and then just start chatting. What you do instead is you prepare. These are the topics that I'd like to discuss, and this is how I think the conversation should go. Then you've got to take the time. You don't want to do it in a hurry. If you've only got 10 minutes between home and school, you don't have that conversation in that 10 minutes. You want to be able to slow it down so the kids feel safe, and you really want to focus on asking the kids questions. So let me give you a roadmap for those questions very briefly. The first thing that I would recommend asking is, what do you know about pornography? And you actually need to use the word, which is why I've used it just now. You've got to ask them what they know about it. Now, hopefully your kids are going to look at you and go, don't know, never heard of it, and they're going to be honest with you about that. Yeah. But there's a good chance that if they're 8 or 9, they may have heard the word. Now, again, every family is different and every context is different. I've got a couple of kids who I waited until they were 11 or 12 before I started having those conversations because I was very, very confident. The thing is, you never really know, but I was very, very confident. Then again, I had another child who overheard a conversation with some boys when she was just 9.
Yeah. Okay.
And so we're like, well, we need to have the conversation. Now, what do you know about it? The next question that I would recommend is, do any of the kids at school ever talk about it? And what do they say? So what we're doing is we're starting very generally. Now we're coming a little bit closer. The next question might be, what do you think would be the best thing to do if somebody tried to show you? Or have any of your friends been involved in these conversations? Are any of your friends looking at it? And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to work out, what do you know? What gaps can I plug? I don't want to give you too much information, but we need to be teaching our kids specifically why this is harmful, why this is dangerous. And the evidence is clear. This content is bad for kids, specifically because it affects their beliefs about what intimacy looks like, which goes on to affect their behaviours about what intimacy should be once they're old enough to start to engage in those behaviours. We've got to make sure that we're teaching our kids about healthy intimacy. Otherwise, they'll have unhealthy intimacy, and there's plenty of evidence that indicates that that leads to problems, potentially lifelong. It casts a long shadow throughout adulthood.
This is probably an intimidating conversation for a lot of us as parents to have. But I think, the reason we wanted to talk about it on the show today is as intimidating, as scary, as hard, as skin-crawling as it could be, because maybe some of us have grown up in homes where that conversation was even more awkward and we're just not comfortable and used to it. It's too important a conversation to run away from that fear.
Yeah, and when I talk to a mum who says that she walked into the bedroom, her son's bedroom, he's 9 years old, she expected to find him playing Minecraft, and instead she found him Googling. Google gives you a lot more information than the dictionaries of our day, and he was Googling a word that he'd misspelled because one of the Year 6 kids on the bus told him to Google it when he got home, and what he encountered and what she found left her weak at the knees. We've got to have these conversations. If we don't, our kids will be exposed to things that will harm them. There's no question they will harm them.
And potentially not just harm them, unfortunately.
That's right, because they will, in some cases, enact what they've seen on others who are usually less powerful, usually younger, more likely to be significantly harmed. Look, I've written a bunch of articles for the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner on this topic. If you were to, and I know some people will be uncomfortable even typing this into their search bar, but if you type in my name, just Coulson, Coulson, E-Safety and pornography, Google will give you the articles that I've written, and they will help you with plenty of guidance.
Absolutely. I've just popped those up and they come straight up at the top, so they're easy to access.
We're in the midst of the podcast, so we're being a little bit comfortable about some of the words we might say or some of the visuals. Someone who was on this topic sharing with us recently highlighted, and it's just one comment, but one comment that broke my heart and scared the living daylights out of me as a dad, was a 13-year-old boy who asked the question in a context of this being the discussion of growing into relationships with women. His question was, do I have to strangle her when we make love? Because he had seen videos, and that's what his sense of normal was. Clearly, as a 13-year-old boy going, something doesn't feel right about that. But the fact that he could even ask the question like it was a thing he needed to know the answer to.
Do they really like it? So a couple of things on this. If we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of this, let's be really clear. Pornography researchers have discovered, and again, I'm not a consumer. I'm a consumer of the research, not of the content. I want to be really clear about this. I'm not watching it, so I don't know. I'm only reporting research. But pornography researchers are telling us that pornography is generally made specifically for men. Now, there are varieties that are now being made with a more female, a more feminine, which means that there's more of a narrative and more of a focus on other aspects, but the majority of it's still made for men. There's a desensitization that occurs. The more you watch, the more you need, and the more aggressive or the more violent or the more extreme it needs to be. And so what's going on is that it's become commonplace, it's de rigueur, for pornography content to be extreme in its violence. And women are universally the victims of the violence. The unhealthiness of the material is breathtaking. I'm talking about multiple penetrations, multiple orifices. I'm so sorry to be saying this kind of stuff. I know many people will find this far too sensitive to listen to. And I'll stop there. Suffice to say that this is not your run-of-the-mill intimacy that perhaps was on the pages of the stuff in the 1980s that kids used to sneak out of their quote-unquote dad's bedroom. Again, I came from a family where this wasn't the case, so I'm reporting what other people say. The challenge, Luke and Susie, The challenge here is that our kids see this stuff, they think it's normal, and they feel like they're supposed to enact it.
Yes.
When we teach our children about intimacy, usually I would suggest around about the age of 14 or 15, we sit down with our kids again and we have a much more in-depth conversation about true intimacy.
Yeah.
And then we do it again when they're about 17 or 18. And we want to focus on words like gentle and patient and slow and pleasure, because pornography is not about any of those things. Pornography is about performance and exposure.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's about extreme and personal gratification. But anybody who's in a loving, intimate relationship knows that performance is the last thing that you worry about. I know some people are sniggering at that, but what you worry about instead is how can I help my partner feel my love? How can I give them the most positive experience here? And usually it's the man who has to think about that, because men will be pleased most of the time without too much trouble. Which means being slow, being gentle. And we've got to teach our kids that, because what they see in pornography is the opposite. And if they continue to try and enact that, they're going to have miserable, intimate lives, which is horrible, right?
Yeah. Dr. Justin Coulson, thank you for talking about. We've taken a lot of words away from you to be able to use today.
Well, I wish that I could say that it was a pleasure, but I'm going to say that it was necessary.
It's such an important conversation, and we thank you for having it with us today.
Glad to help.
If you enjoy the podcast, please take a moment to rate it on iTunes. When you do that, it increases the visibility of the podcast and helps more people to find it. And if you're not a subscriber, jump onto Apple Podcasts and subscribe so that you can hear every episode as soon as it is uploaded. For more information on all of Dr. Justin Coulson's books, programs and podcasts, go to happyfamilies.com.au, or if you'd like to have Dr. Justin Coulson speak at your school or event, go to justincoulson.com.